chat again. Happy to join my fellow melanin challenged commentators for I was pitching Unmelanated podcast for the show title, but White Guy Wednesday.
White Guy
I suppose
Wednesday.
that'll work. Yeah.
It'll work. Well, Kuba, I wanted to get your thoughts before we kind of wrap up this section of the chat discussion. When you look at the causes of the Iraq War, what do you see as being the primary factors that drove it? What shifted the United States from a policy of containment, which seemed to have worked for 12 years, or at least what why did suddenly weapons of mass destruction become this big issue? Why was this shift? Do you see it as being fundamental ideological changes? Do you see it as economic changes in economic interests? What would you say was the primary cause of the war? Of course, these things are multi-causal, but what do you see as driving this shift and this like brutal drumbeat to war that ended in the invasion?
That's a big question, and I'll start with the argument that I heard from one of my, I think that Ben called them PMC bloodsuckers. Dear friend from college, very sophisticated, very bright guy. He is now well embedded in sort of establishment Washington-based intellectual circles. He unfortunately, and we all have our flaws, is on the more cosmopolitan libertarian part of the centrist spectrum. And he, having spent time as a precocious teenager and student in Cambodia, in the Middle East, across a wide variety of countries in the global South, he was convinced that the war would usher in a reconfiguration of the geostrategic reality across the Middle East, that with the Saddam regime replaced by a...
You mean he thought this at the time?
He thought this at the time.
Uh-huh.
He was convinced that Rumsfeld et al. Had a plan that would, at the very least, secure the territory of Iraq as a American strategic bridgehead, allowing them to apply to directly contain Iran and apply pressure on states such as Syria, Lebanon, for a comprehensive regional peace. That this conflict could break open the Middle East in the same for pro-American neoliberal reform and more complete integration into not only economic global networks, but also in what might be called at that time like the post-historical civilization of liberal democracy, a la Fukuyama, that Iraq was going to be the Poland of the Middle East, that was going to be where you could reconfigure and reorient an entire region towards an Atlanticist participation in what the first George Bush called the New World Order. And that this geostrategic goal was going to be of great humanitarian benefit, especially to the people living in the region. It was going to be an enormous economic windfall. Of course, it would secure the security interests of the state of Israel. And then weapons of mass destruction, these kinds of things, they were secondary considerations, and kind of that was the PR part of it. The real benefit, the real upside, the real opportunity for the United States was this once in a generation shift in the regional orientation of the Middle East. And
So why don't you just call your friend a neocon? I mean, isn't that wasn't that the feeling in 2003? I mean, weren't those the general neocon ambitions? That seems like a very able recitation of, what
enough.
the dreamers in Washington were saying. And,
No,
would that it had happened. I
point
mean,
taken.
you
Yeah,
can't like
exactly.
criticize them for
your
the
lips to
ambition.
God's ears. If that had been the outcome compared to what we got, then I would trade for that in an instant. But what we got was infinitely worse. I don't call him a neocon simply because, apart from that position, he's been much more diverse, heterodox in his foreign policy views. He's, for instance, much more sympathetic to Russia than neocons now, and he was never firmly in that camp. I'm not talking about David Frum.
I mean, I think it's kind of interesting that we talk about neocons, but that is kind of like a partisan label, because there may be differences in imperial strategy between Republicans and Democrats, but between the Samantha Power types and the Wolfowitz types, there is actually functionally not that much difference. They believe in the righteousness and application of American imperial power to reshape the world according to their desires, which obviously, to emphasize, have economic implications, but are part of a broader narrative that they in which they see the world. I think what makes the Washington foreign policy blob so dangerous, what makes think tanks so dangerous, is not cynicism, but they're like ideological delusions. That
And the way that, if there's cynicism exists, but like in capitalism, it's not the greed of the individual capitalist that is the problem, or that creates conditions of exploitation and concentrates wealth. It's the systemic incentives that anyone who aspires to that position, anyone who the system permits to fill that role, experiences. If you are absolutely cynical sociopath who will toe whatever line is the most expedient for them, yeah, you'll do fine. You'll do fine, but it's actually kind of a lot of work and relatively unglamorous compared to where else you could go with that ambition and without any offsetting scruples. What happens instead is that true believers are selected for, and then inside, anybody who recants is purged, and it's that kind of HR level enforcement, ensuring that the people that you need to think something, or think it from the start, and you can lock them in. That's how the groupthink, the ideological orientation, is reproduced and enforced.
I mean, if I could just jump in briefly, Derek, but wasn't the whole thing in a sense? I mean, this is why I was sort of highlighting, the dreamy-eyed character of, the Wolfowitz Rumsfeld worldview back at that time, that it was the opposition that was truly cynical, that the opposition never really seemed to have any, they didn't see, obviously there was no concern on the left, it seemed, for Iraq. That always seemed like pretty spurious. The fate of the Iraqi people, democracy is not a part of their culture, and Saddam Hussein's tyranny is a sovereign state, and so it seemed very comfortable with the status quo. And
at that point,
the right seemed to have a monopoly on like a vision for the future. obviously I remember anti-war rallies, the conspicuous absence of Iraqi speakers across the West. I mean, I went to anti-war rallies in Chicago, in Washington, in London, in India, and I remember being at the World Social Forum in Mumbai, and the Iraqi Communist Party getting booed because they were arguing, look, the Americans are the only thing that stand between us and the death squads right now. And so the left just really couldn't deal with, this. Obviously, it was the cynicism of the right was rooted in something like, can you be cynical by virtue of your naivete, right? Can you be that naive about the effects of your actions and so forth, and the kind of, there was obviously like they were taking responsibility for world history, right? They were going in, they were saying, we're going to do this. America's going to take this step. And I think that it completely blindsided the left. But then you would get these moments where, well, you've got to fight with the army that you've got. And, like, okay, they looted the museum and there's like rampant crime and murder in the streets of Baghdad. What are you going to do? You're going to break a few eggs. It was that kind of flippancy that belied, I guess, a kind of cynicism. It was very, I think at the time, especially for younger people, it was really hard to kind of say who's the cynic.
Let me jump in there, because I think we have to like differentiate between a number of different forces that came together in opposition to the Iraq War and different perspectives. So, for me personally, and I didn't suffer from the Iraq War, physically, or had any negative consequences personally from the Iraq War, but in the lead up to the Iraq War, I was opposed to the Iraq War. I joined the demonstrations. I was part of this, and I think there was a contingent who were able to thread the needle on one hand between the idea that Saddam Hussein is a brutal dictator, that he's barbarized the Iraqi people, but if the history of American imperial intervention in the developing world is anything to go by, American intervention is only going to make things worse, and we should oppose this war because it's going to have disastrous consequences. And it's going to have unforeseen consequences, and it's going to, destabilize the region. I think those people were proven right. I think what Spencer is referring to, and I'm
going to say something completely outrageous and heterodox.
But let me
is the record of American imperialism as clear as what you just said?
Well, it is.
Aren't there loads of places that flourish after?
Not in the Middle East, I would say. Probably not in the Middle East, at least. But what I would say, there was an undercurrent of a kind of relativism that, in opposing American imperialism, kind of degenerated into a cultural relativism that became sympathetic to Saddam Hussein, to Islamism, who could not fathom why certain groups like the Iraqi Kurds, like some Shia, will be happy to get rid of Saddam Hussein, as if those people had no knowledge of the cynicism of American imperialism, the fickleness of American imperialism. I remember my father telling me, he was like, oh, the Americans are definitely not our friends, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Saddam Hussein was our enemy. At one point, the Americans supported him. Now they're turning against him. This is our opportunity, etc., etc. And what I found like distasteful about the anti-war movement, and kind of depoliticized me for a while, was this valorization of Baathism and
George Galloway,
valorization of Baathism and Islamism, which
I was about to say,
which were repulsive. So I think it's unfair to say that all the anti-war movement was of the variety of the type, the kind of cultural relativist who said, this is Islamic societies, this is what they're used to. I think there were people who focused more on, that this was going to be a disaster and it was going to have unforeseen consequences. And, I've personally found it difficult because it's like hard to argue with my family, my community, my friends who had suffered under Saddam Hussein, who had massacred between 100,000 and 150,000, 100,000 or 200,000 people in Kurdistan in 1988, which was in very close living memory. And like say, hey, this war is going to be a freaking disaster, when they're like, what the hell are you talking about? This is the guy who the Americans backed, and now he's pissed off the Americans. It's time to get the boot back. It was personally like pretty uncomfortable. My dad was going on TV defending the freaking Iraq war, right? Saying that, we're going to be glad to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And at the time, I couldn't quite articulate why I thought this was going to be bad. But, in retrospect, I've come, to some, perhaps more organized thoughts about why it was inevitable. It wasn't just a matter of bad policies, but why it was going to be such a disastrous war. But it was profoundly disorientating and uncomfortable time for me because like Saddam Hussein wasn't the freaking good guy. I remember at SOAS there were students waving the Ba'athist Iraqi flag. And, the Iraqis were like, this is like...
You didn't attend SOAS, did you?
I did my undergraduate at SOAS, the School of Ornamental and Ridiculous Studies. But Kuba, you wanted to jump.